In this session, we're going to be discussing EQ or equalization. Lesson structure-wise, we're going to start off by having a bit of a chat about analog versus digital EQ. I'm also going to look at some of the terminology that we use where discussing EQ. We're going to look at different EQ types. And we're going to have a bit of a look at using EQ while recording. And we'll have a bit of a demonstration of that. So, in practice, we use EQs to alter the tonal characteristics of a sound or group of sounds. This can be done as a creative tool or ideally a creative one, and there are many different approaches to EQ. So, say for example, my approach, I don't like this word at the recording stage. I don't mind this word at the mixing stage. I'm really not a fan of it at the recording stage. And the reason behind that is, at the recording stage or the audio capture stage, I've always found that it's best to get it sounding amazing off the mic without the need for any corrections using kind of outboard equipment or whatever. So the better you can get it sounding right off the microphone with no extra EQ, compression, whatever, the better it's going to end up being overall. So I like to use EQ to exaggerate what I've kind of already got right, in the sense that, you know, if you stick a room microphone in the room with a drum kit, and it might inherently not have as much top end as is kind of commercially standardized. So we end up, we have to add top end onto stuff. A vocal isn't naturally as bright as it is in recordings. We have to add that bit of top end on there as it's just become commercially standardized to do that. But again, I would want the vocal to sound awesome straight into the right mic for that vocalist, so that when I EQ it, I'm going to be helping something that I've already got right, rather than trying to fix something that I could have done better. Think of it as EQ can only ever make something that sounds alright sound pretty good, and it can only ever make something that sounds pretty good sound awesome. It can only do so much of an improvement to it. So try and always get your audio capture bang on off your microphones off the bat, and then use EQ to complement that, or alternatively use it as a creative tool to really kind of warp a sound into something completely different. But those are kind of my approaches to EQ. Different practitioners will have different views on that. However, I think the generally held opinion of using an EQ at a recording stage is that it should be used to help something rather than fix it. So EQ is the process of altering frequency content in a signal by boosting or attenuating frequencies. So those are the kind of key words that I've highlighted there in bold: boosting or attenuating frequencies. I hear a lot of people saying that EQ adds low end or adds top end. Not necessarily the best terminology, because EQ isn't adding anything to that frequency content. It's enhancing, or alternatively, if you're not doing a great job of it, making worse, frequency content that's already there. So if, let's say, you record some hand claps from the other side of the room, there's not a whole lot of low frequency content in there. So boosting up the low frequencies there isn't going to get you any more body in those claps, because there's no low frequencies in that to boost. Hence again why I say just get your microphone right in the first place and then help it with EQ. I'll say, for example, I'm speaking through an EQ now. So as I'm quite close to the microphone, I can boost low frequency information, and it's fairly audible that I'm doing that. And I can cut low frequency information, and that's fairly audible as well. Whereas if I set my EQ flat and move to the other side of the room, as I'm speaking now, I've added the same amount of bottom end that I did earlier, and there's not really a whole lot of difference in the bottom end of my voice. That's fully up. Whereas if I'm closer to the mic, there's a significant difference there, and I'm making the same adjustment on my end here. So if your mic placement is right, your EQ's job is a lot easier as well. So again, EQ is used to alter or fix how something sounds, or its general tonality. Again, I try and avoid the word fix at recording stage. I keep specifying recording stage, by the way, because I feel that at mixing stage, it's kind of, you may have missed something in the studio. There may have been a track that you didn't get the placement right on in the heat of the moment. You missed it, and we need to do some fixing now. I get that happens. That's totally cool. We can learn lessons from that. That's how we grow as producers, etc. Sometimes we mix things that other people have recorded and they may not have recorded it the way we would like to use it. So we have to do some kind of fixing of that. And I get that, and that's totally cool. But as this is kind of an audio capture thing, I would steer away from fix for a while. And fundamentally, if we're using EQ, that means there's something about the sound that we want to change. It's not as good as it could be. So if you're working on a 48 channel SSL, that doesn't mean that you have to use every EQ on every channel of that desk to get a decent sound out of it. It's just a case of what needs it. So again, in the example of this voiceover that I'm doing now, this is my voice without the EQ. That probably sounds really boxy and a bit kind of unpleasant, because you've been listening to it with the EQ on for so long. But it's, we've only kind of got that by contrast. So it's a fairly decent mic for my voice. I know that I've tested out a few different mics, and this is the one that kind of lends itself best to what I want to do. So in a studio situation, I am literally committing to this right now, and I think I can get it a bit better by re-engaging my EQ. And that to me is a little more pleasant of a voiceover sound. But again, I've got my mic set up, my choices are made, and that EQ is working because my mic is in the right place and it's a good mic for my voice, kind of thing. Moving on, no one cares what your mix looks like. No one ever will, apart from you. So ignore your eyes. We're looking at, so this I would say is a disadvantage of digital EQ, that people have a tendency to look at the overall EQ curve and go like, oh my God, I'm boosting 10 dB at 100 hertz. That's mental. Why have I done that? And then you bring it down and you start adjusting your curve based off of how it looks. And it's like, who's ever said, oh yeah, I love that album. It looks great. What do you mean the album looks great? Do you mean it sounds great? It's not about how your session looks. It's about the overall sound of it. So if you have to boost 30 dB at 100 hertz, then that's what you have to do to get it sounding good. If you are having to do that, there's probably some issues with your audio initially, but if that does the job, then that does the job. So your audience won't be looking at your mix, only listening. EQ analyzers can be useful, but I would say only as confirmation or a problem finder, and even as a problem finder, I would hesitate to use that initially. So if there's a real problem area in an EQ of something that I'm working on, my analyzers are always off as a default, and if I can't find the issue at that point, I will put an analyzer on, and then I'll go, oh, okay, right, it's there, I missed it, it's next to that thing, because that's going to help me learn how to constantly EQ better. And I would advise kind of doing the same thing of avoiding, EQ analyzers until you've given it a go with your ears first, and then we can use analyzers and stuff to point ourselves in the right direction, or as confirmation that what we've done is kind of going to work. Close your eyes and listen is a generally kind of good advice for wherever you're doing any audio manipulation stuff. So, bit of EQ terminology I wanted to go over. So we're going to look at high and low pass filters, bell curves, shelving curves, Q/bandwidth, subtractive and additive, and we're also going to look at resonance. So if I can make my way out of this presentation, he says, there we go, I figured it out. Okay, so I've got some materials that we actually captured for this session that are going to be in the video at the end, and are in this session here. So I've got an EQ just on the stereo out, and I'm going to be working with these acoustic guitar tracks. So first of all, I'm going to start with a high pass filter. I'm going to be using this FabFilter Pro Q3, largely because I can make it full screen. Look at that, the dream. There's also some amazing benefits to this plugin, but I'm not going to get into that too much. So a high pass filter kind of does what it says on the tin. It allows the high frequencies to pass through the filter. So I'm just going to turn this analyzer off for a second so that's not distracting me. Okay, so high pass filter lets the high frequencies pass. This is also known as a low cut. If you're allowing high, you are disallowing low, so they are the same thing. We can also do a high cut. So again, a high cut would be a low pass. Okay, so with that, there's a couple of uses for high and low pass filters. Again, I know we're discussing kind of at the recording stage here, but I do want to look at some advantages of kind of working in the DAW. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a low cut or a high pass. And this is something that I like to do with EQ, is that I'm going to start pulling this across to the right. So I'm going to start cutting out more and more low frequencies. At the point where I feel that it's not having, or where it begins to have a negative impact on the audio and I begin to lose some bottom end, I'm then going to pull that back. Okay, so around the 100 Hertz mark, I'm not really hearing too much difference there. Where I go past kind of 120, 130, I start hearing the bottom end roll off a bit. So I'm going to keep this at 100, and I'm going to turn that off and on. And hopefully you'll realise that there's not going to be a very significant difference. So I'm really not hearing too much in this frequency area. Very, very, very subtle difference there, if any. So the reason I've done that is if that's not making a sonic difference, then surely that means all the stuff down here, I don't need it. So if I have my analyzer on, let's do this pre. You can see I've ended up following the curve of the analyzer there. But we do have some bottom end information around here. So, although we've got frequency content down there, it's not doing us any favours where we're actually listening to the guitar. This again is why I don't necessarily like having analyzers on the whole time, because I don't want to be tricked by, oh no, I've got frequency content down there, I don't want to be removing bottom end. Whereas we've all just heard that made very little difference where that was there. So anything below that 100 Hertz area is really not doing me any favours, and if anything, it's just going to make the mastering stage more difficult. So high cuts or low pass filters, we can do a similar thing there. these tend to not have as much of an issue. So your low frequency stuff carries a lot of like energy in terms of the mix, and having too much of that gives you a really kind of muddy bottom end, and it can start setting off your limiters and stuff. Your high frequencies aren't as much of an issue with that, so I'm going to be really kind of gentle with how I do this high frequency move here. So again, I don't really want to go over the top with that, and I think the high frequency stuff on this guitar in particular with this mix is going to be quite useful, so I'm being pretty gentle with the curve there. Now I wanted to look at shelving filters. So I'm going to go to a clean EQ here, and I'm going to open up a shelving filter. So a shelf essentially has its center frequency, and it says anything kind of below this is being boosted by the same amount. But we do have a little S-shaped ramp up to that. So you've got this kind of backwards S shape here. So your center frequency, where you're working with shelving filters, is actually kind of a halfway point where, yes, I'm doing a 3 dB boost at 400, but I'm not actually getting that 3 dB until I hit this kind of 200-ish area here. It's actually 100 hertz. So I'm not getting that 3 dB boost until I hit 100 hertz there. And I'm actually boosting frequencies from as high as around 1K, 1.2K. So just bear that in mind where you're looking at kind of EQ values, that although it says kind of 400 on it, that's the center frequency of that curve, not the highest kind of peak value of that. So shelving filters are really good for making kind of general broad stroke improvements to the audio. So let's see if we can get this acoustic guitar sounding a little brighter. Okay, I'm happy with that. Just a little 3 dB boost there did the job for me. Again, you just like, I did that subconsciously, the fact that it was 3.19 dB. I wanted it to be 3 on the nose, but why? No one's going to know that it's 3.19. That's just me being OCD about it. So if that's what sounded best, just leave it. This is, again, one of the disadvantages of using digital EQ, is that although it gives you all this great information, I have an annoying thing with numbers where 3.19 is winding me up, and I want it to either be 3 on the nose or 3.2. But that's what I decided sounds best, so I'm going to live with it and ignore my own ridiculous kind of obsession with rounded numbers. So I've used a high shelf there, and it's really given me some nice overall improvement in the top end. We also have bell-shaped filters. With bell filters, your center frequency is accurate to where that boost is at its peak. So if I set a bell curve at 200 hertz, then it's increased by whatever dB I set, 3 dB at 200 hertz. We do have, again, a ramp from much lower down and a ramp from much higher up, but your center frequency for that is your 200 hertz. So I have a bit of a kind of rule of thumb with this stuff, that if I'm working on a melodic instrument, I'll avoid bell curves in the low end, and I'll use shelving curves instead. So I'm going to find a section where I can kind of illustrate to you why that is. Okay, so I'm just going to stick with the section we've got. Actually, it should work fine. So we can hear there, I've got 2 chords going on. So let's say I'm mixing this, and I'm gonna just loop this 1 bar so I can get my EQ perfect. Again, I'm going to turn my analyzer off. Okay, that 164 is really helping me in terms of bottom end. But what's going to happen when I have a chord change? So I've discovered that this chord sits at around 164 hertz, so it's likely an E. What happens when he moves off that E though to, let's see, is it a higher or a lower chord? So he moves slightly up the fretboard there. And if I turn my analyzer on, it will illustrate that now I've got like a 3 dB boost where he plays an E, but as he moves up the fretboard to, it sounds like he might move to an F or an F sharp, I'll have less of an increase there. So my E's will be louder than the other chords. And I get a lot less bottom end in that second chord. So with melodic stuff, because the bottom end moves around, I prefer to stick to shelving filters. So let's go back to a shelf here. Sorry, I've used a high shelf there. Because this, I can set to whatever the highest chord is and just make sure I've got the same amount of bottom end increase across kind of wherever he's lower in the fretboard. So I'll set this, just leaving the track play, and on the kind of higher chords will be where I really focus that in. And you can hear now where we have this lower note around here, it's a lot more of an even, consistent low end. So let me copy that across to my A setting, and I'll change this to a bell curve. I'll have it around where it was before, and then we can just listen to the difference in consistency on the bottom end of this guitar while I'm jumping between a shelf and a bell curve there. For me, with the shelf, it's a lot more even and a lot more consistent. So I'm fairly cool with that as where my shelving filters would be. But I might use a bell curve just to do some kind of general tonal shaping. Again, I'm going to introduce that low cut. And let's have this set to clean so we can do a kind of a clear A-B comparison there. So I'll start without EQ and then I'll put it back on. Okay, so we've had there high pass, low pass, shelving, bell curve. Some of the other stuff I wanted to look at was your Q value. So your Q value is essentially will control resonance and the shape of your curve. So if I turn this Q value to your right, you see how that curve is becoming more and more severe, and I start having these resonant peaks here. I would say, as a general rule of thumb, the wider Q value you can get away with will sound more natural and will sound less manipulated. The more aggressive you are with Q values, the more obvious it's going to be that you've done something to the sound. So again, with this really kind of broad, gentle shelve here, it doesn't really sound that much like an EQ'd guitar. It just sounds like a nice guitar. Whereas where you start getting super aggressive with stuff, you get these weird resonances, and it sounds manipulated and not quite right. We can also use our Q value. I like to use this for eliminating any irritating kind of resonant frequencies. So if you have your Q value set extremely high, and if there's any frequencies that are particularly troublesome. That frequency was kind of bothering me a little bit. It wasn't a huge problem. I tend to have a problem with 4K on a lot of stuff. So I kind of use a really, really sharp Q value there, and just to kind of hunt down where that annoying frequency was. Once you've found that, you can then go to the final kind of EQ shape, which is a notch. And as you can see, a notch is just a real kind of precise surgical move that's going to remove that frequency from the audio spectrum as much as possible. What I see a lot of people do is just use a bell curve and then bring the gain down. There's a couple of problems with that. One is that this is only allowing me to do that by 30 dB on this EQ, which is still a lot, but look, it's not gone as far as a notch filter would. And also look how wide the Q value is there. So I'm actually getting rid of quite a bit of top end by doing that. Whereas with a notch, that tightens up and I have a lot more reduction. Again, with low and high pass filters, we also have this dB per octave control. So again, sound is measured in octaves. So 80 hertz at an E is also going to be 40 hertz at an E will be the octave below that. So where we have this dB per octave control, that will determine how aggressive your slope is. So I'll use that on this low cut because it's a little bit more visually obvious. So let's go for something like a 96 dB per octave cut. So look how much more aggressive that is. And for me, that's going to be a lot more audible and very difficult to place that and have it still sound natural. Versus that just sounds a little bit more natural to me. Great, so I don't think this guitar needs too much more work than that, and you can see across the board I've only used very kind of gentle boosts of up to kind of maxing out at around just under 4 dB there. Didn't feel like I needed to do much more than that, so let's just have a quick A-B. Great. That's again one of the advantages of having a digital EQ is that you have that super quick AB. You can have as many bands as you want. You have all the visualization. It's got full recall. So if I close this and open the project up, again, it's going to stay that way. And these are some of the kind of things that the analog stuff doesn't necessarily have. But that's not to say that the analog stuff is lesser, maybe just of other value. So we've looked at some EQ terminology there. So I now wanted to move on to different EQ types, and then we're going to start discussing the pros and cons of working with analog EQ. So graphic EQ. This is an example of the API 560, which was first kind of conceptualized in 1969. Graphic EQs are a lot more common in live sound practice. Essentially, if we think of, if you're a studio engineer, well, back in the 70s, you have to get a desk to record loads of bands on. This has very kind of limited spectrum in which it can work. So we don't have control over Q value here, and we also don't have control over frequencies. So we've got these frequencies that work in octaves, and we can cut or boost by 12 dB. That's all we can do in this particular graphic EQ. They're great for live sound. So if you've got a room that's, particularly problematic around 500 hertz, as a live sound engineer, you can go, there's 500, pull it back, jobs are good, and let's move on. But for a studio engineer, it's a little limited in terms of what it can do. There's also quite a lot of very small components to that may be easy to break in a studio situation. And I'm sure you can imagine that, again, this is only like a 10 band kind of thing. that we can go up to like 32 band graphic EQs, and imagine trying to fit 30, however many 32 band EQs on every channel of a mixing desk. Your desk gets pretty big by the end of it. But they are occasionally used in studios for tone shaping purposes. They're just not too common in the studio environment. They are more geared towards the live sound kind of audience. Whereas a fully parametric EQ can fit in the same footprint. So this unit on the right is the same size as the unit we've just looked at, but this gives us full control over gain, Q value, and frequency. We have 4 bands to play with, and we have the option of shelf and bell curves. So we have a lot more flexibility where we can deal with, different bands of different genres coming in and still be able to get the best possible results, because our EQ can pretty much do whatever we want it to do. So you've got your high frequency cut or boost here, which goes anywhere from 1.5K to 16K, which can be a bell or a shelf. Your high mid filter is cut or boost again, fully variable from 600 Hz to 7K, and you have your Q value controllable there. Same thing for your low mid filter, and your low filter operates the same way as your high filter. For any kind of SSL nerds out there, this particular model, this isn't the 1969 kind of iteration of it. The original SSLs, these 2 knobs down here were both black, and they've been replaced with brown knobs where the circuit was updated. So some people prefer the circuit of the black knob SSL EQ to the brown knob SSL EQ. So on the more modern SSL EQs, they have this black button here, which changes out the circuit for your low frequency content. Bit of a kind of nerdy thing, but I'm all for that kind of stuff. So fully parametric EQs give you kind of as much control as you're gonna need over something. We are, however, limited to 4 bands there. That is kind of up to you as to whether that is a pro or a con. I find limitations of hardware EQs to be very useful in a studio situation, because I'm not kind of chasing my tail, adding endless EQ bands, constantly spending half an hour trying to get the kick sounding right. It either works on these 4 sections, or it doesn't work and I need to change my mic. So it can kind of tell you where you need to improve your practice a bit more. And generally, if one of these things can't get it sounding good, then there's something wrong with the source audio. We also have semi-parametric EQs. So where this was a fully parametric and gave us control over kind of all the values, all the key values, semi-parametric EQ makes some decisions for us. So this is an example of the Rupert Neve 1073, which was kind of originally, initially the SSL wasn't really kind of in functional consoles being used until like 75-ish, where Rupert Neve was kind of a little bit earlier to the game. So with this, we have a semi-parametric EQ where we have fixed frequency bands. So we're looking at 35 or 60 or 100 or 220. So this dial here on the outside determines which of those 4 frequencies you're working with. Same thing with this mid control, same thing with the top end control. That they are always shelves, and the one in the middle is always a bell curve. We have a high pass filter, and this was just to control your gain. So we have some control there where we have a fully variable amount of gain but selectable frequencies, and some of them are shelves, some of them are bell, one of them is a bell curve, and we also have a high pass. So it's kind of, it's making decisions for you kind of thing. But again, in terms of workflow in a studio, that's really, really beneficial. So you can say, right, I've got a typical band in the studio today, so map them across my Rupert Neve desk. 35, okay, that's going to be kick drum territory. Only my kick drum can have 35. Next, let's move on to the bass. Okay, so maybe that can have a bit of the 60 Hz kind of area. Okay, let's move on to the guitars. Well, that has to be either 110 or 220, so maybe around the 220. And you're kind of making these very precise decisions along the way. And it's just going to allow your mix to sit a lot more kind of evenly across the board. You're not going to have as many overlapping kind of frequency masking areas going on, because you've got these very defined slots where things are allowed to live. And again, the frequency selection is very clever. 360 hertz. A lot of rooms have an issue between 200 and 400 hertz, so that can help with the kind of muddiness of those early reflections. 700 hertz is a great area for presence on a bass guitar. 1.6 is a nice area for bringing out some kind of detail or definition in a vocal. 3.2 is awesome for getting some like crack or presence or transient out of a snare, and it kind of goes on and on that it makes these decisions for you, and it says, I'm very good at doing this one frequency, just try that. And again, if it doesn't work, then you adjust your mic and you make it work. And it's kind of a bit of a tried and tested thing that, you know, these things have been going since the 70s and they're still selling now. They're still going. Rupert actually sold his company, AMS Neve, quite a while ago, but he's now working with Rupert Neve Designs. But AMS Neve are still making 1073s based off of his original schematic. So, you know, this stuff's been going 50 years and there are tens of thousands of albums that sound absolutely incredible that have been through Rupert Neve equipment or SSL equipment or API equipment. So it's a bit of a tried and tested thing. It does what it does and it does a great job of it. So I guess to kind of prove my point with that, we can move on to the demonstration portion of this video, where I'm going to be using an SSL style EQ, a Neve style EQ, and I'm also going to be using a Pultec style EQ, which wasn't mentioned in this presentation. So I want you to really focus on how I'm using that in the session, and then do some kind of extra research onto, you know, how long has the Pultec EQ been going? What are the typical applications for it? So let's move on to that demonstration portion now. In this session, we're going to look at using analog EQ at the recording stage. So for this setup, we've got an acoustic guitar and singer-songwriter Don Major in the live room. We've also got Thomas doing some extra guitar layers for us. So we're going to be tracking this live, and I'm going to kind of EQ as we go along. So with EQ, it is always something that you could just do afterwards. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that approach, but there are a few benefits to EQing kind of off the bat. So the first one is that you have to think about with EQ, it's not a corrective tool. It's something that we use to help out something that's already good. So with that in mind, as you're tracking, it's really good just to try some EQ moves so that you know by the time you get into the mix, yes, this EQ is going to work, or no, I need to move a microphone, kind of thing. Because if you're looking at EQing afterwards, you're kind of working a bit blind there. So you've got the first benefit of you get kind of closer to your mix off the bat, you know whether it's going to work. Second benefit is you just committing to a decision. So let's think, you can either EQ it in the session, get it done, job's boxed off, fine, or you can EQ it afterwards and spend hours on it. If you do it in the session, you're closer to being finished and therefore closer to being paid. If you do it afterwards, you're going to spend hours and hours and hours tweaking with 100 different EQ plugins. Whereas, you know, this stuff it's built to work and sound good. So I think with that, let's jump into it and we'll get some EQ done. Great. Dom, we're ready for you. If you want to just keep looping the track for us, I'm going to do some EQ, get everything dialed in, we'll see if we're happy with how it sounds, we'll go from there. Cool. If you want to do the counting, mate, Tom's in here, ready for you. Okay, for our acoustic guitar left and right, we're using these two units here. These are Neve 1073 recreations made by Heritage Audio, and they both feature a semi-parametric EQ design. So with the Neve 1073 style EQ, we're working with fixed frequency bands, so we have to select those using the dials on the front, but we do have fully variable gain on each pot there. So I'm kind of a fan of the limitations of the 1073 style design. I think it gets me there quicker in terms of deciding whether I need to adjust the EQ or adjust the microphone. If the EQ can't help it, then the microphone needs moving. And so I'm going to start with the EQ completely off. I'm going to make some kind of drastic cuts and boosts so you guys can hear what this thing sounds like. So what you might have noticed there is that the low end gets a little bit overwhelming where we're working in these higher up 110, 220 frequency areas. So what I like to do is use the high pass filter built into the Neve to just shape that shelving filter a little bit, tighten up that bottom end and get something a little more controlled. Alright, so just while we're waiting for Dom to loop the track for us so we can carry on setting this EQ, I just want to remind everyone that, again, these are selectable frequencies. We don't have a choice of any in-betweens. It is, you're kind of doing what the unit is best at doing. Also, make sure you notice that I'm adjusting both EQs simultaneously. I don't want one side to be bassier or have more high end than the other side. I'd like them both matched in this recording. Alright, so I feel like I've got that bottom end dialed in. Let's see what we can do with the mid-range on this guitar. Alright, so let's move on to the top end. So the top end on a 1073 traditionally is a fixed frequency, either at 10k or 12k, depending what year your 1073 was made. These things have been built since kind of 1970s, so there's been quite a few versions and revisions of them. So let's see what this can do on this acoustic guitar track. For me, with that top end boost, the acoustic guitar just got 10 times more usable. So I'm going to do a couple of comparisons, turning the EQ off and then back on again using those two buttons there. Off. On. Off. On. Off again, and back in. Off, back in. Off again. Great, so I'm cool with the way these acoustic guitars are sounding, and hopefully you've recognised there that, at least to my ear, they sound a little bit more record ready than they did earlier, and I'm going to commit to that as the recorded sound and move on to vocals.
drive slow. This night's a young one and the sky glows. The stars are acting out a movie. You guess the actors, but you can't quite get them right. The road shows these destinations, but you're fixed on.
Alright, so you might look at this and kind of go, what on earth is this guy doing boosting 10 dB at 60 Hz and also cutting 10 dB at 60 Hz on a vocal track? Like, EQ theory has gone out of the window here. So that's one of the great things about working with analog EQ. I'm not mixing with my eyes. I don't care what it says on the front of the unit. I'm basing my decisions off of what it sounds like. So we're in bypass at the minute, and I just want you to listen to the body on the vocal when I pop this in.
There's neon breaking through your window.
Bypassed again.
You do your best to try and call
Back
them.
in. Great, so I'm kind of cool with this mad 7 dB boost at 60 Hz on this vocal. I think it's working. And just remember, no one's going to listen to this with their eyes. We're listening with our ears, so doesn't matter what it says on the front of the unit really in this case. So let's see what we can do with this top end.
And you're driving to remember why you're even here.
Great, I'm cool with that. I'm going to A/B that for you, switching it out and back in.
But the music stopped
So that's
about
in.
an hour ago. And you're driving
Off. So for me, with this EQ bypassed as it is at the minute, the vocal sounds very mid-range focused. It's kind of fighting for the same frequency areas as the guitar. So by adding those top and bottom end filters with the Pultec style EQ, it's really helps the vocal sit in the mix a lot better. So I'm going to let our performers run this instrumental section of the piece, and then I'm going to do some comparisons for you, turning the EQ off and back on again. Just remember again, with the Pultec style EQ design, although we're boosting and cutting at the same frequencies, those Q values are different, and therefore they don't completely cancel each other out. It's just a kind of very unique interaction between those frequency bands. So let's do some comparisons for you with and without that vocal EQ engaged. And here's a great shot of me being an idiot adjusting the EQ and then realising that I didn't have it engaged. So you'll see my hand. There I go. Clever me.
Remember why you're even here. And there's a light on by the stereo.
Really seems to be fighting those guitars where this is in bypass.
And you're driving to remember why you're even here. Why you're even here. Why you're even here.
Great, so with those adjustments, I think that acoustic guitar is working really well with that vocal. I'm just going to do a little bit of touch-up EQ on the electric guitar, and then we'll be cool to start tracking this project. Right, so we've got our acoustic guitars and vocal are dialed in. We've also got some ambient guitar layers from an amp in the live room. My main focus, where EQing the electric guitar in this situation, is going to be making sure it doesn't get in the way of what our lead vocal and acoustic guitar are trying to do. So while I'm EQing the electric guitar, I'm going to have the acoustic guitar and vocal tracks playing simultaneously. So we're working on the desk EQ. This is an SSL style EQ. Now, SSL style EQs, that we're looking now quite a few years after the Pultec, around 20 years, and around 5 or 6 years after the 1073. So there is a little bit more added flexibility here. This EQ is actually a fully parametric EQ, meaning we have full control over frequency, Q value, and gain. So with this we can do pretty much whatever we want, hence why I've saved this for a more surgical kind of precise job rather than broad tonal changes. That's 3 dB off at 10k.
Stereo, but the music stops about an hour ago. And you're driving to remember why you're even here.
Okay, so what I've done there is you will have heard that one really whistly kind of ooh kind of frequency area. So I've just identified there an area where I feel it's clashing with the track. I'm going to pull that out a bit. Just listen how much better this will sit in the mix.
Keep going, yeah. 1, 2, 3, and there's a light on by the stereo. The music stop out and out, and you're driving to remember why you're even here. Why you're even here. Why.
Okay, I'm happy with this. I'm just going to take the EQ off and on so you can hear the difference. So for a final demonstration, I'm going to attempt to turn off all the EQs that we've dialed in so far and pull those back in so you can hear just how much difference we've made overall. That's off. And that's in.
Light on by the stereo.
Off again.
But the music stop out and out.
And back in. So for me, we're turning those EQs off and on and taking a listen to the overall picture now. I don't think I'm kind of reinventing the wheel here. I think the EQs are definitely helping the mix, but I don't think they're fixing anything, and that's the really important point to make here, that where we're in the studio, we don't necessarily want to be using EQs to fix things. We just want to help out something that's already great. If it's not already great, then you need to touch your microphones and get your positions adjusted. But where everything is sounding pretty cool, we can use EQ just to get it pointing a little bit more in the right direction, the extra 10%. So with that dialed in, I think we're going to go for a take.
Cool. One, two, three, four. Drive slow. This night's a young one and the sky glows. The stars are acting out a movie. You guess the actors, but you can't quite get them right. The road shows these destinations, but you're fixed on a pattern painted on the tarmac. It's there to guide you, but you've given up on home. And there's a light on by the stereo, but the music stopped about an hour ago. And you're driving to remember why you're even here. Soft glow, there's neon breaking through the window. Just do your best to try and call them and look for answers, but you've known them all along. You've known them all along. And there's a light on by the stereo, but the music stopped about an hour ago. And you're driving to remember why you're even here. And there's a light on by the stereo, but the music stopped about an hour ago. Driving to remember why you're even here. Why you're even here. Why you're even here. by the stereo, but the music stopped about an hour ago. And you're driving to remember why you're even here. And there's a light on by the stereo, but you're still singing that song, you know. And you're driving to remember